Bullies ripped off deaf girl's hearing aid in front of school. Her response shocked everyone. A story by Heartfelt Tales. The gymnasium buzzed with chatter and laughter as students filed in for the Friday morning school assembly. The bleachers were packed, voices echoing off the high ceilings like a symphony of teenage chaos. Teachers milled around the perimeter, some trying desperately to calm the noisy crowd, others just giving up and checking their phones. It was just another regular day at Jefferson High, unless your name was Emma Lynn. For her, it would be the day the world shattered, and then, slowly, beautifully, rebuilt itself. Emma sat in the far left corner of the bleachers, shoulders hunched protectively, hands folded tightly in her lap like a shield against the world. 17 years old, with soft brown hair that fell to her shoulders in gentle waves and big almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold stories she'd never shared, Emma wasn't someone you'd notice in a crowd. And she preferred it that way. She had perfected the art of invisibility over years of careful practice, sitting in back corners, walking close to walls, keeping her head down in hallways. She didn't talk much, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because most people never took the time to understand her. Emma had been born with moderate hearing loss, a condition that left certain frequencies muffled and conversations difficult to follow, especially in noisy environments like the gymnasium. She wore a small, sleek hearing device behind her right ear, a modern miracle of technology that helped her catch sounds when the world became too overwhelming in its silence. But it wasn't perfect. The device amplified everything, useful sounds and background noise alike, and in crowded places like this, it could be more overwhelming than helpful. The truth was, she still had to read lips constantly, watch body language like a detective studying clues, and sometimes just pretend she understood conversations, even when she didn't. She'd gotten good at nodding at appropriate moments, smiling when others smiled, laughing when the crowd laughed. It was exhausting, this constant performance of normalcy. Emma had always been naturally shy, but her hearing loss had made her even more withdrawn. She sat alone at lunch, usually reading a book to avoid the complex social dynamics of the cafeteria. She walked to classes quietly, arriving early to avoid the chaos of hallway crowds. She did her homework diligently, turned in assignments on time, and maintained a solid B+ average, all while remaining virtually invisible to most of her classmates. While most students simply ignored her, treating her like part of the furniture, a few boys had taken a darker interest in her quiet nature. The kind of boys who found entertainment in poking at the quiet ones, who mistook kindness for weakness and silence for an invitation to cruelty. Jake Morrison. Marcus Chen. Ryan Phillips. The trio had somehow made tormenting Emma into their own twisted game. It had started small, whisper conversations around her and then laugh when she couldn't catch what was being said, her confused expression apparently hilarious to them. They'd drop their books loudly beside her desk and smirk when she flinched at the sudden noise her hearing aid amplified. They'd pretend to sign gibberish with their hands behind her back, calling it deaf language and dissolving into fits of laughter when other students looked confused. The worst part was how they'd gotten more creative over time. They'd stand behind her in lunch lines, making exaggerated mouth movements without sound, then act shocked when she couldn't understand them. They'd wave their hands frantically to get her attention, then walk away when she turned around, leaving her looking foolish. The teachers never seemed to notice these subtle cruelties. Or maybe they did and just didn't want to deal with the complexity of addressing bullying that left no obvious physical marks. Emma had never told her parents about Jake and his friends. How could she explain that the boys weren't hitting her or stealing her lunch money, but were slowly chipping away at her confidence with 1,000 small humiliations? Her parents, David and Susan Lynn, were already worried enough about her social isolation. They'd moved to this district specifically because Jefferson High had a good reputation for supporting students with disabilities, but Emma could see the concern in their eyes when she came home every day with no stories of friends or social activities. But that day, that terrible, transformative Friday, Emma never saw it coming. As Principal Edwards took the microphone to begin the morning announcements, his voice booming through the sound system, Jake and his crew approached her section of the bleachers. They had that particular look, the one Emma had learned to recognize, eyes bright with malicious excitement, that smug expression that always meant trouble was brewing. She shifted slightly in her seat, trying to focus on the principal's words about upcoming events and academic achievements, pretending not to notice the three boys climbing toward her. "Hey, Emma," Jake whispered, crouching beside her, speaking just loud enough for her hearing aid to barely catch the words. His voice carried a false friendliness that made her skin crawl. "You can hear us perfectly fine, can't you? All this deaf girl stuff is just an act, right?" She looked at him, confused and startled, unsure if she'd heard correctly. The combination of his quiet voice and the ambient noise of the gymnasium made it difficult to process his words. Was he actually trying to have a conversation with her, or was this another setup for humiliation? Marcus leaned in from her other side, his sneer visible in her peripheral vision. "Yeah, she just wants attention. Special treatment. Watch this, we'll prove she's faking it." Before Emma could react, before she could even fully process what was happening, Jake's hand shot out behind her ear. His fingers found the small plastic device that connected her to the audible world, and with a quick, violent motion, he yanked it away. The tiny piece of technology, her lifeline, her connection to sound, her bridge between two worlds, was ripped from its place behind her ear. Emma gasped, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to echo in her suddenly muffled world. Everything became distant and unclear, as if she'd been plunged underwater or wrapped in thick cotton. The familiar background noise of the gymnasium, conversations, footsteps, the principal's voice, all became a blur of indistinct sound. Panic flared in her chest like a physical flame. She reached desperately for her hearing aid, but Jake held it high above his head, beyond her reach. "Look everyone!" Jake shouted, suddenly standing up and waving the small device in front of the entire gymnasium like a trophy. His voice, no longer whispered, carried across the space. "Emma Lynn can hear perfectly fine. She's been lying to get pity and special treatment. Watch this." The words hit Emma like physical blows. The entire gymnasium, hundreds of students and dozens of teachers, turned toward them. She could see faces swiveling in her direction, mouths opening in surprise, some laughing, others looking shocked. The principal had stopped speaking. The microphone had gone quiet. Every eye in the building seemed focused on her humiliation, on her most private struggle now displayed like entertainment. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, a burning embarrassment that seemed to radiate from her core. Her chest tightened with a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. She could barely process the visual chaos around her, just the shapes of mouths moving, pointing fingers, the blur of faces turning toward her like flowers following the sun. Some students were laughing, others looked uncomfortable, a few teachers were starting to move in their direction, but it all felt surreal and distant. Her hearing aid was gone. Her privacy was violated. Her trust in the basic decency of her classmates was shattered in that single moment. She ran out of the gymnasium, her feet pounding against the polished floor. Down the hallway, past surprised teachers and students who were late to assembly. Into the nearest bathroom, where she locked herself in the farthest stall and finally allowed herself to break down completely. The sobs came in waves, heavy and uncontrollable. Her whole body shook with the force of her crying. How could they be so deliberately cruel? How could they humiliate her like that, in front of everyone she'd have to see every day for the rest of the school year? The worst part wasn't even the public embarrassment, it was the violation of something deeply personal, the weaponizing of her disability against her. She didn't go back to class that day. When the school nurse found her an hour later, Emma was still crying, still shaking. The nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind and gentle, helping Emma contact her parents and retrieving her hearing aid from Jake, who'd been sent to the principal's office. But the damage was done. Emma didn't return to school the next day. Or the day after that. Her parents, David and Susan, were devastated when they learned what had happened. David, usually calm and measured, was furious in a way Emma had rarely seen. He wanted to call the school board, demand consequences, maybe even press charges. Susan cried and held Emma close, apologizing as if her daughter's pain was somehow her fault. "We should have prepared you better," Susan whispered. "We should have taught you how to handle bullies." But Emma asked them not to make a big deal of it. She didn't want more attention. She didn't want to become the girl who couldn't handle a prank. She didn't want people looking at her like she was broken, more broken than they already thought she was. For 3 days, Emma stayed home, wrapped in blankets on the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened and what came next. She felt hollow, defeated, like something essential had been carved out of her. But on the third night, something shifted inside her. Emma sat on her bed, staring at herself in her bedroom mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in years. She saw a girl who'd spent 17 years apologizing for existing, hiding in corners, making herself as small as possible to avoid bothering anyone. She was tired of hiding. Tired of pretending that being invisible was the same as being safe. Tired of letting other people's cruelty define her worth. She opened her laptop and started searching. First, she looked up local self-defense classes, scrolling through options until she found a Krav Maga studio downtown that offered classes for teenagers. Then she typed something else: how to be confident when you're different. Overcoming bullying. Finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. She read articles and watched videos until late into the night, absorbing stories of people who'd faced adversity and found strength. She learned about activists and artists, scientists and athletes, people who'd turned their differences into superpowers rather than sources of shame. The next few weeks transformed Emma in ways she never could have imagined. She started attending Krav Maga classes every afternoon, taking the bus downtown to a small studio that smelled like sweat and determination. The instructors, led by a compact woman named Sarah who moved like a dancer and struck like lightning, never treated Emma like she was fragile or broken. They didn't need her to talk much, they needed her to move, to learn, to believe in her own strength. Confidence isn't about being the loudest person in the room, Sarah told her during one particularly intense training session. It's about knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Emma learned how to use her whole body as an instrument of power. She learned how to stay grounded when pushed, how to move with intention, how to defend herself not just physically but emotionally. More importantly, she learned that strength wasn't about dominating others, it was about refusing to be diminished by them. At school, Emma returned quietly after her brief absence. The hallway whispers followed her, the uncomfortable stares, the mix of pity and curiosity from classmates who'd witnessed her humiliation. But something was different now. She wore her hearing aid proudly, adjusting it openly when needed rather than trying to hide it. She walked with her shoulders back, her head high, meeting eyes instead of avoiding them. What her classmates didn't know was that she carried something new inside her, not anger or a desire for revenge, but an unshakable sense of her own worth. Jake and his friends seemed to sense the change. They still smirked when she passed, but they kept their distance. Maybe they thought they'd accomplished their goal, or maybe they sensed that their old tactics wouldn't work anymore. Emma didn't care. She had bigger things to focus on. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. In March, Jefferson High announced Disability Awareness Week, a series of assemblies and activities designed to promote understanding and inclusion. Mrs. Rodriguez, the school nurse who'd helped Emma on that terrible day, quietly approached her with an invitation. "We're looking for student speakers," she said gently. "People who can share their experiences, help others understand what it's like to live with a disability. I think you'd have important things to say." Emma's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of standing in front of the same gymnasium where she'd been humiliated made her stomach churn. But as she walked home that day, Sarah's words echoed in her mind: confidence is knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. That night, Emma sat at her desk and began to write. The following Friday, the gymnasium filled once again. Same bleachers, same echoing voices, even the same 3 boys who'd made her life miserable. But this time, Emma walked through the crowd toward the stage, her heart pounding but her step steady. Her legs trembled as she climbed the steps to the platform. Her palms were sweaty as she adjusted the microphone. But she held her head high and looked out over the sea of faces, some curious, some bored, some actively hostile. She took a breath, raised her hands, and signed her first sentence in American Sign Language, then spoke it aloud with clear, deliberate words. My name is Emma Lynn, and I want to tell you what strength really looks like. The gymnasium fell silent. 3 weeks ago, some of you watched as my hearing aid was ripped from my ear and held up like a trophy. You heard me called a liar and a fake. You saw me run away in tears. She found Jake in the crowd, met his eyes directly. You think being deaf means I'm weak. That I'm stupid. That I'm pretending to get attention or special treatment. But I want to tell you what my life is really like. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued, sharing stories she'd never told anyone. She talked about the exhaustion of constantly translating a world that wasn't built for her. She described the isolation of sitting in groups where conversations moved too fast to follow. She explained how she'd learned to read emotions on faces, to understand the music of body language, to find meaning in gestures and expressions that hearing people never noticed. I've spent my whole life learning how to hear with more than my ears, she said. I've read faces like books. I've watched gestures like a detective studying clues. I've learned to understand people without needing to catch every word. I've lived in 2 worlds, the hearing world and the deaf world, and it made me stronger, not smaller. The room remained perfectly still, hundreds of teenagers giving her their complete attention in a way she'd never experienced. I've learned something else, too, Emma continued, her voice now steady and strong. Bullies take away things from others because they think it gives them power. They mock what they don't understand because it makes them feel superior. But real strength isn't in cruelty. It's in standing back up after being knocked down. It's in speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes. It's in refusing to let other people's fear and ignorance define who you are. She paused, looking directly at Jake, Marcus, and Ryan. You tried to break me in front of everyone. You wanted to make me feel ashamed of who I am. But I'm still here. I'm not hiding anymore. And I'm not ashamed. Emma's voice rose with passion and conviction. To everyone who's ever felt different, who's ever been mocked for something they can't control, who's ever been made to feel less than, you are not alone. Your differences are not weaknesses. They are the very things that make you uniquely powerful. By the end of her speech, the gymnasium erupted in applause. Teachers stood. Students cheered. Some were crying, moved by her courage, inspired by her strength, ashamed of their own past silence in the face of cruelty. Jake and his friends sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and uncomfortable. Not because they'd been shouted at or publicly shamed, but because they'd been confronted with the reality of their actions, forced to see Emma as a real person rather than a target for their entertainment. In the weeks that followed, Emma's life changed dramatically. She wasn't invisible anymore, but this time the attention was positive. Students approached her in hallways to thank her for her speech. Teachers made efforts to ensure she was included in classroom discussions. The principal announced new anti-bullying policy specifically addressing harassment based on disabilities. Emma started a support group for students with disabilities, meeting weekly in Mrs. Rodriguez's office. They shared stories, offered advice, and supported each other through the daily challenges of navigating high school with differences that others couldn't always see or understand. Jake, Marcus, and Ryan never bothered her again. In fact, Jake approached her one day after school, awkward and red-faced, to offer a clumsy but sincere apology. Marcus and Ryan followed suit, each in their own way acknowledging that they'd been wrong. Emma forgave them, Not because what they'd done was acceptable, but because she'd learned that carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick. She had bigger things to do, a brighter path to walk, a voice that needed to be heard. She had found her strength, her purpose, her voice. And this time, the whole world was listening. If this story moved you, if Emma's courage inspired you, then we want to hear from you. Comment below with your thoughts, share your experiences, or just send some love to all the Emmas out there who keep standing tall even when the world tries to silence them. And if you believe in stories that touch the heart and awaken the soul, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heartfelt Tales. More true, emotional, and powerful stories await you. Let's spread kindness, one story at a time.